noise that you might hear in the background is my phone's kicking off, and then I'm sure that will disappear in a second. So yeah, some great conversations there in the breakout rooms. I could see that lots of discussions had across them. So we're going to move on now to the live panel session as promised. Capably chaired by Dan Hill. So I'll just make sure that we got all the speakers gathered, Dan, and then I'll hand over to you. So we should have obviously got Stephen Imi, so there's Cameron and Dan Tulin and John Christophers and Louise.
Yeah, they can take their cameras, put their cameras on so we can see them, then we can spotlight them.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, great. So if you could just do that, Louise is there. Hi, Louise. So John Cameron, and should be just John Christophers, I think, and or Dan Tulin.
I'm here. Do I need to join on a different link?
No, it should just be a matter of our end just to switch you into the room. There we go. So it's just, yeah, I think we're good. So Dan, you're sitting comfortably?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so we've got this we've got this scheduled until 11:45, Dan, but happy to be a bit flexible on that if you kind of get in the flow. Hopefully you can see the questions in the Q&A feed there as well to draw from as well. But other than that, I'll leave you to it.
Thanks very much indeed, Graham, and very glad to be chairing this session. What an incredible range and group of people we've got here. So I'm really excited by the discussions we're going to have. And do keep on adding questions into the chat. I'll try and ask as many of them as possible during the session. I suppose just to kick off, I was really struck by this morning's session, in a way, by the contrast between the way in which some of the current funding retrofit programs are set out, the SHDF and the ECO, which are often quite technical. There's a lot of detail in there of what requirements are and how they get set up. And some of the sort of more community-based initiatives, which are sort of more bottom-up and more emergent. And I think it would be perhaps interesting to start the conversation with you, John, because you kind of sitting at that interface between local community and working on one of these bigger programs, and just to reflect a bit more on how you would how communities can interface with those big programs and what could work better if they were to be redesigned.
Okay, well, thank you for putting me on the spot, Dan, and thank you for articulating. I think there's been a real, in my mind, there's been a real divide this morning and in one of the breakout groups that I was in, between, on the one hand, the vision that Imi and Cameron, and hello to you both, and I at Retrofit Balsall Heath, and to some extent Dudley have articulated, and the much bigger schemes which have been done in different ways. And we had a difficult choice with Retrofit Balsall Heath when Ellie Horrocks-Smith rang up me and Cameron and said, look, we've got this money. You Balsall Heathens have been campaigning this sort of, amazing vision of community-led, no one left behind. We've got this money. And I think I spoke to Imi as well. And, I respect that we sort of, we took different views at that moment. Cameron and I and Retrofit Balsall Heath thought, this isn't set up as a completely perfect community leadership model that we want, but we're going to have a go at it. And I think it strikes me that I think the successes that we've had in Balsall Heath are partly due to Cameron articulated beautifully all the local networks and the imams and Sheikh Nuru advocating this at the Al-Abbas Islamic Center, and he'll be with us on Saturday as well. Anyone who can come along. So all of that community on the one hand, and then trying to sort of almost retrofit community into a big top-down scheme. And it strikes me that we're really, I think some of the failures and the communication breakdowns which Dan Hill has articulated earlier, I think there's learning from, but it seems to me that there's a much bigger systemic shift needed. And the precedent that I advocated fleetingly in my little presentation was the Housing Action Trusts. We've been here before, and I think when the Housing Action Trusts were set up, so I'm going back to the 90s here, there were problematic estates like Castle Vale in Birmingham, but the government instituted a thing with a community-led board, where the board was made up of more than 50% residents on that board. So it was a true sort of community governance model. And I think that's where these two things can come together. If the community is not seen as someone to engage or involve further down the line, but if the actual governance involves real community people, and that needs to be properly thought about, to be inclusive and to be resourced, and so forth. But I think if the community can then be involved at that stage and can feel that this is not a scheme which is being done to them by others, by however well-meaning, but is being done by and for us, then I think the outcomes will be completely different. So I think it's that governance piece in which I'm not an expert, so I almost want to throw this question back, although it's not my role, but to Dan and Imi, thinking about, you know, big systems change. How do we get that community governance piece so that there's you know, really robust, inclusive, properly resourced governance that the community can be involved with? Because I think that's really the key to bringing together these two quite different approaches, really. So that's the sort of learning from Balsall Heath. We've tried, and some bits have worked really well, some bits haven't. But I think it you know, they all make the argument for that one thing.
Thank you, John. I mean, well, let's go to Imi and ask that question about governance and how you're thinking about it. And I guess, Imi, in your answer, it'd be really helpful to pick up one of the questions asked by someone on the Q&A, which is about how you actually start in a place where you might not have the richness of the groups that John and Cameron and others have been working with. They have 23 groups in a size of a community of 4,000 homes. That's pretty exceptional. Also, he's obviously an incredibly sort of rich area from that perspective. So yeah, perhaps you could touch on both those points, Imi, if you're able to.
Yeah, thanks so much, and yeah, thanks so much for the first answer, John. And I think you know, it's when John mentioned, you know, we had a slight difference of opinion. I think it's more from my perspective, that was also about what our different organizations are situated to do, right? And I think that at that point we were very much in the place where we felt that we were best placed to try and push what could be possible beyond that, and where John and Balsall Heath were in a really good place to kind of hack the existing system as far as they possibly could. And I think one of the important things in all the questions that come up is how we understand what our like superpowers in that knotty system are, and then how we kind of like try to join together. Because I think having like any one position of that this is how it's going to happen, I think is a really sort of difficult place to be. So I think it's been really great to learn from, and the panel that John mentioned this morning, the community panel that was at Retrofit Reimagined, it was so fascinating that this group of 30 or so neighbours who had gone through this process, who turned up to the panel. I mean, many more neighbours had gone through the process, but there was about 30 people there in that chat. They had all started to, without kind of realizing, referred to like quite big, exciting systemic shifts that would make things better. You know, they talked about all the things that you know, a systems change expert would say when they'd say, well, the funding needs to be more like this. We needed communication to be more like this. We needed to work not as individual householders. We need to work as a neighborhood. You know, and so I think that space of like the governance piece then to start to formalize that is obviously a huge question, right? And in some of the work that we're doing, one of the critical pieces is that we don't just jump and recreate the same governance structures at a micro scale that are creating the challenges at the macro scale. So for example, we've been testing, and our partners at We Can Make in Bristol, who are also doing a retrofit street, project have been testing a range of different mechanisms, from governance games, from co-designing what a street-based entity would look like, where does the value go that's generated, how do we make decisions. There's been a beautiful experiment in Bristol around how to use quadratic voting, which looks at how a street can decide, you know, if there's 100,000 or 200,000 pounds available, what is the most appropriate and most generative use of that money, rather than just being told, well, the scheme says you have to spend 10 grand, you have to spend 10 grand, you have to spend 10 grand. There's only solar panels available this week, even though you needed something else. So we're going to put solar on. And that other thing you needed, well, we'll figure that out later, right? And so this idea that communities and streets that are engaged in this story can actually really look at the decisions on the street and aren't all self-interested has really been proven by the work that Bristol are doing. And quadratic voting allows you to take things into account, right? Like if there is a single parent with 3 children in a damp home, the street might vote to put more money there and a little bit less elsewhere, because the way that sort of street-based organizing is happening is starting to take many different things into account. What it also starts to do is open up conversations between all the different types of tenure that are there, and allows people to really engage with that. So where some homes might not have been able to have the same as the owner occupiers, but the community have been working to think about how to give that home other things that help them to feel part of the story, whilst we're still hacking and trying to figure out how to make this huge amount of resource work better. So from our perspective, the work has been prototyping those small layers. You know, what is a street entity? How are decisions being made? How do we think about allocating resources? How do we think about the most collective and generative benefits, rather than a cookie cutter approach to every home in separate ways? And just to that question of like how to get started where there is nothing in the way that you described is in Balsall Heath or in a place like we're in. I would say like one of the fundamental start points with that is to kind of try to remove this idea that it has to be professional and organized, like organizing or organizations that have to exist. There is always really, really deep, rich, generative wisdom and assets in a place. The conversation might not start from, let's go to a community group and talk about retrofit. It might start from the knitting group, and it might start from the food bank. It might start in a front garden. It might start from just putting a bench out and starting to have some cups of tea. I think the one thing that is very, very clear in all of the work that is taking a neighborhood or street-led approach is that you do have to really start with those human layers. And once those human layers connect up to these schemes and to these stories and to these other ways of being able to bring that story together, that's why community, like the story of community and neighborhood-led retrofit is starting to thrive, because the people who decided, like the question that Dan asked me earlier, the people who decided why have you got involved in retrofit? Because we have no history in that space. We came into it because we weren't, you know, trying to deliver a professional scheme or been in the built environment for 20 years. We came into it because we heard that hundreds of millions of pounds were going back to central government, and we couldn't understand why, because we knew all these neighbours and communities who wanted to design differently. So I think that, like I always say this, put a bench in front of your house and have a cup of tea with your neighbours. Go to where convening is already contextually happening, whether that's in the mosque or in the Gurdwara or in the sewing group or in the local food bank, and start there. Because I think if you start from a professional conversation, it's very hard to find. And it's also not like most people aren't thinking, you know, what I'm going to do on Saturday is I'm going to go to a conversation about retrofit. You know, it's not what your average person is thinking. So you've really got to look at the fabric and community life of your neighborhood and understand where the wisdoms are, where the challenges are, and bring a really hopeful, thoughtful conversation into that. And it takes time. But once you get going, I mean, as John shows as well, the possibilities just unfurl. People are like, and we could do this, and we could do this, and we can start doing that. So yeah, that would be my advice.
Thank you, Amy. That's really helpful. I mean, I'd be really interested in understanding, maybe Dan from E.ON, your perspective on this, because you're there having to deliver substantial amount of changes. You've got a lot of restrictions on how that money is spent. And we know a lot of the low-hanging fruit, should we say, in the easy measures have been sort of done under previous programs. So how is, where would you say the opportunities are for someone like E.ON in this sort of more community-led space, and what differences would you like to see in the policy environment?
Lyle, thank you for that question. And Amy, really insightful, and thank you for that. So from an E.ON perspective, for us to be able to grow the projects, we really want to work closely with the faith groups and community groups based in Birmingham, because from a past experience, we've noticed with residents that they do have maybe a bit of nervousness about signing up to, say, an eco scheme or a GBIS scheme, because potentially what's happened in the past. So what we're trying to do is engage with those community groups and faith groups to grow the scheme and try and support as many residents as we possibly can, because from a funding perspective, Eco4 and GBIS is here till 2026. We want to try and install through E.ON's funding as many properties as we possibly can. Like I mentioned on my presentation, we've circulated 3,000 letters around 50 LSOA areas, and we want to carry on growing that moving forward. But my thoughts are that we do need to go to those food banks. We do need E.ON representatives speaking to residents on a day-to-day basis, talking about the benefits of the retrofit and the improvements that our funding can help towards those customers' properties.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's how do you bridge that gap in the most effective way, as you say. So yeah, that's really interesting. I guess one of the other questions that's come through the chat as well. I mean, obviously, communities are not one tenure; they're multiple tenures, and and people don't necessarily want to be seen as a tenure or that tenure. Steve, in terms of the work Equans is doing, obviously on Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, the SHDF, this whole area is full of horrible acronyms, and that's just one of many of them. How are you looking with your partners at the council and other places to look at an area or community-based approach when you don't necessarily have the money for every tenure?
Yeah, I think that's a trick, really. How can you get an entire community bought into a scheme? It's a shame when one of the biggest bugbears of mine is when we do a retrofit scheme for social housing, that you end up with this pepper pot approach, and the social houses get done, but the privates get left behind. And the reason the privates get left behind in a number of cases is because the funding isn't there to support the same intervention as what's happening on the social stock. Obviously, if you take like the SHDF funding element, typically you're getting around £10,000 per property, but the measures what we're doing might be up at £20,000 and £30,000. So when you go to a neighbouring property, a private, then the private property has got to find quite a bit of capital themselves, and ultimately they can't afford to do it. So the privates don't tend to be done. And we also work with eco funding, which Dan's been talking about. And the problem with the eco funding, as much as it's a really good initiative, it tends to get focused on measures what can be fully funded, because that's where the installer can get it away, rather than necessarily what's best for that house and what's best for that community. And again, you fall into that trap that there's a shortfall in the finance and the residents having to pick up that shortfall. And we've got examples what we have done in other areas of the country where the council's really got behind it, and we've supported like a cross-tenure community-based scheme. So an example would be in Holbeck in Leeds, where we've done around 300 houses.
Right.
But probably around 60-65% of that were privates. But what you ended up with there, with the council got behind it, and there was various funding pots what went into it, but ultimately there was a low-cost loan as well what got put in, and it made it viable the privates could afford to have the works done, and that was really good because it ended up with a really big community uplift. And I think what's exciting, what's coming down the road now, and we're interested obviously getting involved with discussions with the council around this, but the devolution funding, what's coming down the road for particularly the West Midlands Combined Authority. The government for SHDF money, so they've got the SH for Wave 3, what's coming out in the autumn. They've got SHDF, but running alongside that, they've got the LARS funding, which is the Local Authority Retrofit Scheme. And what they're wanting to encourage, and the engagement we've had with DESNET, is they've put them 2 pots of cash available to try and make community-based schemes. And that's kind of music to our ears, because then we can go into an estate, and regardless of what the tenure is, we can put an offer together for the private residents and the social residents. And then if you can get the entire area bought into it, you're then into the stuff what Louise was talking around can we get community energy systems to work and that, because you're doing an entire area rather than just pepper potting the houses. And I think that'll be really interesting to see what the West Midlands Combined Authority do around the devolution schemes. Can we make area-based retrofit work? Because I'm certainly on board with like what Imi's been saying around, if you can get the community bought in, it's a complete area uplift, and the entire community comes along with the programme rather than we've just done the social.
Well, thanks, Steve. I mean, I would encourage everyone on this call or listening to definitely engage with the devolution piece, because I know it's kind of boring governance stuff, but essentially it's a trailblazing deal that the West Midlands Combined Authorities negotiate with central government, where the whole pot of retrofit money comes for a number of years from 2025 onwards. It means that the West Midlands has more flexibility. So all those complicated tables that Dan was showing earlier on, there's going to be more flex around that, which allows for people in this room, frankly, to be helping to shape how that money is spent and to try and stop the problem that Imi talked about earlier on, which is money getting sent back because not all the stars are aligned. So I suppose naturally, Louise, the question for you is, you're working on a project in Dudley, which is looking to be part of this single sort of area-based approach. Can you talk a little bit more about how you're thinking about governance and community involvement in that process and changing the sort of standard approaches, and secondly, how you actually see the money flowing across the different tenures?
Yeah, sure. So I think on the first point around the community and kind of the governance, I think that is, the project is still quite young compared to others here. So we are really still getting to know the community to a certain extent. As was mentioned, that people don't on Saturdays talk about retrofit naturally, so they go to other events, and so you have to actually go and meet them at those events and understand what the needs are of those communities and how you can actually take them on board for the design. I think the governance question then around, that having that voting system, having all of those things in place, I think takes much more time than we would probably like it to take. With SHDF and all of these programs, kind of have 2 years to deliver these programs, and there isn't really the right amount of time or the right amount of money put into understanding the community and making sure that you design something that works for the community. The measures are basically imposed at the beginning, and there's no kind of choice around what needs to be done. So we're really taking an approach of getting to know the community, understanding what they actually need. And then we will set up, a governance, especially if we manage to bring kind of community energy scheme together, that goes beyond just kind of energy efficiency measures around retrofits. So I think we haven't figured that all out. I'll come back in a year and tell you what we've done and how we can move this forward, but at the moment I won't have all the answers. Then in terms of the funding question, I think that's really a good, this project, the advantage of this project is that we actually can kind of spend the money however we want, or however the project deems is useful, which is really great. But what we've also done, right, initially it was 1.65 million that we got. Now we're closer to the 3.5 million. And that's only because we've managed to kind of bring in other funding sources and kind of cross-pollinate different funding streams. But the reality around that is that we're back in a scenario where we have to spend the money in certain timeframes and on certain measures that aren't necessarily, you know, in the best order that we actually would, you know, how we would best do them. So there is already this problematic that comes back that has been mentioned here around, you know, the measures that we have to do today are not the measures that we would do today if we could choose, but we have to kind of spend the money, otherwise it will go back to central government. So I think that that's kind of where we are at the moment, is because of these constraints. We've spent nearly all of our money to date. We haven't spent that much money yet, but most of the money we've spent to date has gone into social housing, because that's where the funding has come in and where there's constraint around the funding. And we want to make sure that the rest of the funding, the one where we have more flexibility with, we spend it in the right way with the right measures on the right properties. And so obviously we're a bit further along on that, or less far along, a bit further away from actually spending that money today. But we are looking to kind of distribute that. So there's obviously on this project, there's not just housing or retrofit funds. It is much broader, but what we're spending, or what we've ring-fenced for retrofit, we're going to spend that more or less along the lines of how the tenures actually are. So looking at, you know, the kind of, it's about 20, no, sorry, I think it's about 30-40 split between social housing and owner-occupier.
Right.
So that's how we're thinking of spending the money. And then they're the private rented. And then obviously, like, there is some flexibility. We don't have to spend it exactly like that. That's kind of the idea of the funding, that we follow that so that there's an equal distribution across tenures.
Thank you, Louise. Obviously, a really exciting project in Dudley, and one definitely to keep an eye on, because it's trying to do this in an integrated way, and there'll be loads of learnings from it, I'm sure, which I think will be great for everyone to hear about as you develop that project. I mean, one of the challenges, I suppose, for the idea of community-led retrofit is often, you know, communities are diverse. There's lots of different people talking in different ways, and they may not always agree. I'd like to kind of, and that might be seen as a challenge by either a contractor or by government trying to put money in, or whoever it is. So I'd just like to ask Cameron, thank you first of all for your incredible presentation earlier on. It was, I've not seen it before. It's really inspiring. But I'd like to ask you a bit about how you, in your experience and that of your organizations, like, how are you managing to align 23 community groups, or however many there are that are actively working in this space, in a way which allows for these programs to actually happen? Because you know, that could be seen as potentially a difficulty as well as an opportunity.
Thank you. When I started this retrofit journey with John Christie first, I had hair then. So it's all gone now, hence the hat.
Sorry, Cameron.
It's okay. There's lots to unpack here that everybody said, and how, I mean, faith is just one tool in our community. You know, we have so many different characteristics of identity that we identify with. One of the difficulties we find, like, my parents came here in the 60s, and I'm sure Imi's parents came here, and so many, and we've been here for generations. I'm a third generation for my family. But we're still talking about how do we engage with our communities decades on. And from a community's perspective, this is quite repetitive, perpetual. We'll have it again. We'll have it again in 5 years, in few years after that. And communities normally stay embedded where they are. It's the council or the statutory bodies or the big companies that come in that constantly change and are having to relearn. And that tends to be quite frustrating at times. So with places of worship, everything you do, you take everybody along the journey with you. And I spoke about how you do some of those things in my presentation, so I won't repeat them. But one key thing that came out of this from both John and Imi is differences of opinion. thing is, with communities and with those who we work with, we have these conversations and we can accept differences of opinion and we talk to each other and we get through them. But what we tend to find is when we work with the systemic organizations, once you have a difference of opinion with them, you then have a ceiling, because the sort of response you'll get is, oh, you know, we can't do this, policy dictates this, oh, system is hard. You get this quite often. So we get stuck no matter who you speak with. So when we talk about redesigning, which was your original question, is who is the redesigner? And who are we doing it for and who are we doing it with? You know, there's no such thing as the community. There are, you know, this is a conversation we've all had, you know, the difference between community-led versus led by communities. And every different communities will have their own leadership. There's no one style of leadership. And it's important for the powers that be not to just focus on one or two and get to know. And I think Tokir made a comment that there has to be long-term thinking. There has to be long-term embedding into the community. Don't see this as something we have to do within 9 months or 1 year. And that's the same, please, for the likes of, you know, Equans and Eon. And, you know, I hear some good things about everybody, but make sure you talk to your bosses about being here for a few years at a time and bring everybody on board. Balsall Heath is a brilliant example. You know, a few years ago, you know, we've had different pockets of things going on, and we're now emerging as a very unique, innovative, forward-thinking community, even though everyone has their own little vision. But it's been inspired by certain people, that's taken people on, and faith groups have joined the party. You know, I think a little bit late to some degree to the climate discourse, but they've been at the forefront of COVID, other community tensions, community activism. So they've been there. It's just that for the first time, I believe they have access around the table. And you're seeing faith groups talk beyond now just behavior change, but they are now talking about, you know, being involved around the policy table. And just to give you some good news, which will come out soon, like some of the footsteps, for instance, you know, and Bahu Trust have partnered and received a sizable grant to capacity build faith groups to be able to make systemic change. So that should be an exciting project that you'll hear about more in the coming months.
Thank you, Kamran. We've got a few minutes left. I just want to touch on a couple of questions that have come through the Q&A. Let's just briefly talk about skills and training and what communities can actually do for themselves, rather than depending on contractors to come in and do all the work. So I just wouldn't mind a quick reflection on, and obviously there's pros and cons to that as well, but a quick reflection on that. First of all, perhaps from you, Imi, on some of the work you've been looking at with the neighbourhood trade school, and then maybe touch either on John or Kamran to hear from your perspective as well in the work you just touched on. First of all, to you, Imi.
Thanks so much, Dan. Yeah, so we have a number of different like entry points into this work, from, like I said, the cup of tea on the street, to thinking about your front garden, to neighborhood trade school, which has many different layers. One of them is a peer-to-peer layer, where we just start with the simple idea that everybody has something to share and everybody has something to learn. So whether it's how to change your tap, how to change a washer on a tap. Clearly, I don't even know how to do that because I don't even know what the sentence is. But you know, to making last night's class was making a pizza with foraged ingredients from Edgbaston Reservoir. It starts with this idea that everybody has wisdoms and skills, and in barter exchange we can start to change and share them with each other. It's includes no financial exchange. It is a space for communities and neighbours to share skills, to learn about one another. And then within that neighbourhood trade school, we then have the next layer, which is skills for transition, which is once we've built those like very everyday relationships over the cup of tea, over a chat at the street to coming and sharing some skills where people can then go on to more formal courses about biomaterials, around solar, around retrofit, and build up those skills. So for us, we've just been gently building a sort of codification without becoming like an organization that is just slamming a program on people. First, you'll have a cup of tea with us, then you'll share some skills, then you'll retrofit your home, because nobody does that sort of thing. But really starting to create a bit of a stack and a methodology around, okay, after that, then what's the first little micro grant people might need to do some changes on their street? Okay, after that, how are they organized as a street to start organizing around retrofit? And so for us, what we're doing is just start building that stack, which turns up in the everyday, but has a flow through from that first conversation. But that conversation starts from their wisdom, their skills, their knowledge, their hopes, their dreams, their experiences, and that is what is honored first. And the rest of the story like joins that and joins it really humbly and thoughtfully. And I just want to say that, like, on that piece of you get a whole street done, yet there is this piece that it's more effective, it's more collective, no tenures are left out, you know, we don't waste so much time with deliveries and all these sorts of things. Like, the reason for that is also, we've got to hold on to what the bigger reason for this is. It's actually like from there we start to think about like substantial climate transition, we start to think about education outcomes, we start to think about health outcomes, and we talk about that uplift. That uplift is going to be life-saving in the coming decades. So we've got to remember that when we're talking about retrofit, we don't just get lost in it's this technical change to reduce some carbon emissions, reduce some bills, and to do some health benefits. This is going to be the difference between life and death. This is going to be the difference between whether we can cope with the trajectories we're on. This is going to be the difference whether we can pick ourselves up and rebuild our economic and social transition as well. So I just want to say that, like, you know, from that first cup of tea, I never see it as a way to just be talking to do something marginal. That you've got to, if you in this work, you've got to be able to see the systemic in every interaction, because this work we're going to do is going to be the difference whether we can actually turn this story around or not. And I just wanted to kind of really root that back, because sometimes community is seen as like a nice little C, the lovely people who do the lovely things, and all of us serious people do this stuff over here. But it's not. This is going to be the difference as to whether we can really transform and uplift the situation we are in this country, and turn that around. And I think retrofit is a very important way in which we can create many more of those generative benefits.
Thank you, Amy. As you say, I think the consensus is that we're going to be heading towards a very significant increase in temperature globally, and that will have much more serious impacts, unfortunately. Karen or John, I don't know if you want to touch on what actual skills can communities implement in your view, given what you've been working through. I don't know maybe one of you can take that question, and I'll maybe ask Steve and Dan to also think about the sort of.
Would you like to talk to that, Cameron, or I'm happy to if not?
I'll very quickly say something and then you can comment, so I won't take too long. So for us at the Bahu Trust, for instance, I mean, in our area of Balsall Heath and wider areas, we are trying to figure out who's best placed to do what, so we're not replicating and we're not competing with each other. So from a Bahu Trust perspective, the area of expertise that we're now developing is tackling social and climate justice, and how do we take those voices to the top table. So it's all about training our local communities to be able to advocate effectively, to be able to say the right things, to be able to take their voice, to be able to bring about policy change. So they're not just at the bottom of the chain, but they are trying to influence policy as much as possible and make sure that we work with key people in companies, with the energy companies, with the council, with the authorities, for us to be able to bring those local stories and try to bring about change. So that's where we're kind of focusing at the moment. John?
Great. And I think one model I just want to throw in here, which I think has been really successful in Manchester, is the Carbon Co-op, where their cooperative has both resident members of the cooperative who want to get their homes fitted, but also trade members who have got those skills. And I think building that local, hyper-local microeconomy is so critical, because that's where we build trust. And I think there are great opportunities here where, you know, the two ends of the spectrum can come together. Because if you look at someone in Balsall Heath who's been fitting windows for 20 years, who may not have English as a first language, may not have lots of pieces of paper, but has skills and has trust. And if we can look then, you know, looking through the sort of procurement lens and big contracts, I think there are ways that people like that could be mentored through subcontractors who have the right paperwork and brought on. And so I think, you know, I think all these things can come together. But I think, as Imi said, I think building the social resilience, building the sort of, you know, the local network is as important as anything to, you know, to get people together on this. There are lots of other things I could say, but yeah.
Thank you. That's really helpful, John. And from Steve, I don't know if you want to, and maybe Dan can make a very quick comment on how you're thinking about local skills, and particularly there's a couple of questions in the chat around how local SMEs can also get more involved when you're dealing with these big public procurement processes, which are, again, got their own challenges.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. First, I just want to say to John, Cameron and Imi, I would love the opportunity in the near future to hopefully have a face-to-face meeting where we can sit down and talk about how we look to work in partnership. Because for me, it's really important to me. I came from a big community, and I know the importance of working with community groups and trying to improve people's lives, to move forward and improve properties. So yeah.
Dan, I'm afraid I'm getting a little bit of
the opportunity in the next couple of weeks.
Dan, I think we got that. Thank you very much. That's great. Definitely would love to make those connections. Steve, do you want to make any other comments about how plans are considering your supply chain and community involvement in the skills side and SMEs in particular?
Yeah, I mean, from a skills point of view, getting SMEs involved in delivery is something what we're quite passionate about. We try to give the opportunities to bring SMEs on board. I think one of the challenges what we do find with getting your smaller companies on board is around the accreditation side of all the funding what we deliver and ultimately has to be delivered by PATH accredited installers. And one of the things what we put in place as a business was make sure that we've got all the measures included under their own PATH, and that does allow us then to open that supply chain up and bring people in board that might not necessarily have got the PATH accreditation, but we can help them work towards it while working underneath our accreditation. So that's something what we're keen to do. And for the success of any successful delivery of schemes, having local labour who take pride in that community and take pride in the work and having that availability of resource locally, that's something what we try to do. And I think through the procurement mechanisms what like the council put in place by forcing people like ourselves to implement having KPI targets for local labour, I think that drives that supply chain and that training initiative through as well.
Well, thank you. I'm going to take the opportunity as I'm still chairing this session to keep on going, because I think the conversation is super interesting. And I have one sort of final sort of wrap up sort of question a bit for each of you. I'm going to make each of you kind of, should we say, minister for community retrofit for a day, and you can make one, or maybe one significant change that you'd like to see that would really, from what I'm hearing here, there's a big sort of agreement that actually there is a real important role for communities in retrofit. Currently, the system makes it hard for that to happen. And so I'm asking each of you to come up with a thought or an idea that you would propose if you were put in that position for a day. And I'm going to give that power initially to you, Kamran. Do you want to start, and then we'll go around?
No, let me come back later. Gather my thoughts.
All right, okay, go on then.
I'm happy to go first because I'm really sorry. I'm also going to have to drop off shortly. But yeah, by the way, this is not the only solution, because if I was government minister, I'd understand that there are many journeys we have to make simultaneously. But just as we made the neighbourhood GPs to democratise health to the people when we needed to transition, and we made the NHS, I would be looking to re-infrastructure and bring back whatever the equivalent of the neighbourhood GP would be, to put the hands of climate transition and retrofit into the hands of people. So I'd be looking for us to have neighbourhood versions of retrofit advice and delivery spaces that give the skills and the tools and the organising to uplift neighbourhoods over the next generation at pace, just like we improved the entire health of the country after the war. We would rebuild people and planetary health over the next generation. That would be my pitch.
You set a very high bar, Amy.
Can you tell I've thought about it?
Well, I know you're probably asking questions too much.
Unfortunately, I'm never going to go into politics, so I'm never going to have my day where I get to stand up and say, "This is what we're doing."
Jane.
I think you do very well if you did, Amy. So thank you for that. I'm just going to pick people at random. Louise, do you want to? Can I pass the baton to you? No pressure.
No pressure. It's great to pass after someone who's actually thought this through. I think it's a really tricky one. I think probably there's something to be done around, and I don't have an as well thought through solution, but there's something to be done, I think, around giving people an understanding and the tools to do something more generally about the climate change kind of emergency that we're in. I think that there's, housing is a obvious big one, especially in the UK. But really, I think I would want to make it more general and say, well, actually, how do we make sure that communities understand the risk and understand the situation we're in today? I think there's a real educational piece that needs to be there, and to understand the specific risk to you, because when we hear about it, it's always something quite foreign. I think, that's something that is going to happen in 2020, 2050. And then you don't really see how that relates to you when it's at a GB scale rather than at your neighborhood. So I think I would try and have something, around what is your neighborhood going to look like in 5 years? What is it going to look like in 10 years, in 15 years, and in 20 years? And here are things that you can do against it, and have some kind of trusted organization that you can go to and communicate and talk about these things at a local level. So I know that's not directly linked to retrofit, but I think that would then lead to people think differently about how they retrofit, if they want to retrofit, the impact that they can have, not just around retrofit, but also around how they vote in other areas, how they spend their money.
Thanks, Louise. And Imi and my organisation also have done some work on what does a 3-degree neighbourhood actually look like. So I think that's trying to come talk to that. Thank you. John, you're next on my screen. Your minister, please give us your idea.
I think we need to just redefine retrofit as much more than just insulation. And so I've talked about this in different venues that, and I hope the presentation that I did, and indeed what Kamran and Imi and others have said, mean that this is a much bigger thing. It's about social infrastructure. It's about biodiversity. It's about our values, our faith. It's about what sort of society we want to see. So I would like to take that big vision of community, because I found when I've gone into people's homes and I've said, we've got this scheme, we may be able to, get some insulation and stuff, people have been excited. But then when I've said, for Balsall Heath, we see this as part of a much bigger thing, and I've painted the picture that I've just said, and people have then got really excited about it, and I've shown you the work we've been doing. So I think if we can think of redefine retrofit as something much bigger, and to plant a seed with every community group, every faith group, locally up and down the land. I think they're going to grow at their own rate, in their own way, in different ways. But if we can start that process, then, you know, some places will be ripe for, you know, the mega investment of wall insulation and heat pumps and whatever sooner than others. That's probably quite a good thing, because we haven't got the money or the carbon budget to do everyone at once. But we can start now, straight away. Perhaps we should have started 40 years ago, but we can start now in every community, and, you know, building on the answer that was given earlier, I think, but by Imi, we've got, you know, every community has infrastructure, and I would add schools to that. You know, I think the schools and the mums and toddlers groups and all the rest of it, in addition to the food banks, every community has got this infrastructure. And if we take Imi's radical model of, you know, the neighbourhood GP, I think we need to plant that now, straight away, but with a much bigger vision, and then, you know, move on from there, so that would really just allow certain things to grow at different paces. And, you know, we're very blessed in Balsall Heath that, you know, despite all our indices of deprivation, we have got social infrastructure. Others may not, they'll grow at different speeds, but let's plant the whole lot now. That would be my intervention.
Thanks, John. That sounds like a very wide-ranging single thing. Thank you so much. Dan, what idea would you
So my thoughts would be moving into the next iteration of, say, Eco 5, potentially GBIS, where it's more focused on communities, because at the moment under Eco 4 it's kind of that single property approach where it's just measured. But I think where E.ON could play a key part in that is by listening to the community groups and faith groups, taking that information, and when we're lobbying back to DESNZ and Ofgem to hopefully look to influence the schemes moving forward. So yeah, that would be my thoughts on how best to move this forward.
Thanks, Dan. Very focused and practical, super helpful. Steve.
Yeah, I'll come at it from a slightly different angle. I think that with all and I touched on it earlier, I think to get all the community involved and get complete community regeneration and area-based schemes, I think that the single biggest barrier to doing that is the finance, in particular for the privates. And if I were the minister, I'd be creating a national infrastructure fund, which would allow low-cost finance into this area, which ultimately local authorities could administer and give access to the private market. An example being, if you were to create a national infrastructure fund where you could get low finance bond into it, people could access, and you was to be able to put that through someone's council tax at, say, £50 a month, that'd create £18,000 over a 30-year period. And then that blended with government funding like your SHDF, the eco funding, what Dan can access, etc. All of a sudden you can create a substantial pot of money what's affordable for people to actually create area-based retrofit, and it's tenure blind. It can go across all different tenures, and you could also involve things like schools, libraries, public building into that. But I think the biggest thing is if you can crack the finance bit and make it affordable, it can then filter down to the community level to say, right then, this pot of cash is available. It's an infrastructure fund. It's not going anywhere anytime quick. And you can actually build projects bottom up and actually get true output and at some scale at a community-wide basis. And I think that's an opportunity what the West Midlands have got through this devolution funding, to have a look at how can that sort of structure be put together on a local area basis and create a bit of a revolving fund of how can you get community-based, area-based retrofit. So
Thank you.
Not straightforward, but
no, I think it's all part of the picture. Thank you, Steve. That's great. And Cameron, lastly but not least, over to yourself. If you could, about a minute, give your idea.
Okay. We have many great ministers in this room, by the way. You should stand for election. It's not long to go now. If I was a minister, I think the first thing I would do is instill a sense of empowerment and hope into local communities. I think that's so important, because the state of our political and systemic discourse, there is a huge trust and hope deficit. So the first thing I would do is just give people the confidence that we are listening to you. Things are never perfect. You know, communities have been through so much trauma throughout, but they get through it. They support each other. Something I picked up from Joe Hindley, a friend of mine, and John Christopher's better half, when she said to me, we need to work on retrofitting people's hearts and minds, not just buildings. So that's what I'll be working on.
Thank you, Cameron. That's a beautiful and very apt thing to end on. So thank you, everyone, very much for your involvement. Thanks for the people who've stayed on the call. Most of the work that we talked about is open source. If you want any more information, drop us a line. You know, I think what this conversation has been for me has been some key messages, which are, first of all, the community involvement. I think there's a huge amount of alignment actually amongst everyone on this call. Everyone thinks it's a really good idea. Currently, some of the systems don't help, and they need reform. It's a long-term set of ideas and requirements, not a short-term 18-month, 2-year thing. The stuff that John and Cameron have been working on in Balsall Heath is a multi-decade story actually. But I think if we look back in 10 or 20 years' time, you know, if some of these ideas are taken on board, then we can see perhaps a real shift in the way that retrofit's thought about, and maybe Birmingham can be kind of key, and the West Midlands I think will be a key area of innovation and delivery in the space. But thank you again, and over to Graham.
Dan, thanks so much, panelists. Dan, I'm going to put you on the spot, actually, given that you've just done that to all the speakers. So you're now minister. So what does Minister Dan Hill implement? What's your intervention?
I think, I mean, it sounds crazy, but I think the idea of building long-term local capacity to enable these changes to happen is absolutely crucial. My personal view is that there's not a one-size-fits-all. So the idea would be that we have enormous devolution taking place. So the kind of trailblazer deal that West Midlands has done, we do have that on steroids for every area of the country. Each area then decides how they want to implement the changes, and subject to achieving some broad outcomes. There's a sort of 5 or 10 year fund. It's a cross-party fund that's set up to enable all that to happen, give that certainty to everyone in the system that they've got a process to go through, that all the parties can work together, and it's not imposed top down. I think we are one of the most centralized country certainly in the so-called developed area, and we definitely need to build trust and trust local places to be able to do what they think is right for their area.
Excellent. Great. Thanks, Dan. Sorry to put you on the spot, but I thought it only fair of the other panelists, given that you you put them on the spot.
Oh, well, yes, it's very fair of you.
Excellent. So thanks so much, Dan, for excellent chairing and for your contributions earlier. Thanks to all our speakers and the panelists. I'm going to throw in